The swings creaking stopped when the park fell completely silent. 8-year-old Tommy stood in the middle of the playground, surrounded by parents pointing at him. "He's bothering our children," they said. "This place isn't for him," they said. Then the sentence that came out of his father's mouth changed the life perspective of everyone in that park. Riverside Park had always been the crown jewel of Millfield neighborhood. Every Saturday morning, it transformed into a bustling hub of family activity. The carefully maintained playground equipment gleamed under the morning sun, and the sound of children's laughter created a symphony that could be heard 3 blocks away. Sarah Martinez had been coming to this park for 2 years now, ever since her daughter Emma turned 4. She knew every parent by name, every child's favorite piece of equipment, and every unspoken rule that governed their little community. There was an order to things here. The younger kids got the smaller swings, the bigger kids took turns on the monkey bars, and everyone respected the invisible boundaries that kept chaos at bay. This particular Saturday started like any other. Sarah arrived at exactly 9:30, her usual time, with Emma skipping beside her in her favorite purple dress. The park was already alive with activity. Mrs. Henderson sat on her usual bench, keeping a watchful eye on her twin boys as they conquered the climbing frame. David Chun was pushing his 3-year-old son Marcus on the baby swings, both of them laughing at some private joke. The Johnson family had claimed their spot near the sandbox, where little Sophia was already deep in conversation with her imaginary friend. "Mommy, can I go on the big swings today?" Emma asked, tugging at Sarah's hand with a determination that only a 6-year-old could muster. "Let's see if they're free, sweetheart," Sarah replied, scanning the playground with the practiced eye of an experienced parent. The big swing set, the park's main attraction, had 4 swings, and currently only 2 were occupied. Perfect timing as Emma ran toward the swings, Sarah noticed something different about the park's atmosphere. There was an undercurrent of conversation among the parents that seemed more intense than usual. Clusters of mothers and fathers stood closer together than normal, their voices carrying the weight of serious discussion rather than the usual light weekend chatter. Mrs. Henderson caught Sarah's eye and motioned her over with a subtle nod. Sarah had learned to read these signals over the months. When Mrs. Henderson wanted to talk, it usually meant there was park politics to discuss. "Sarah, did you hear about the new family?" Mrs. Henderson asked, her voice dropping to that particular tone parents used when they wanted to share information without little ears overhearing. New family. Sarah glanced around the park, noting the familiar faces. "I don't see anyone new." "They haven't arrived yet," David Chun interjected, having overheard while pushing Marcus. "But word is they might be challenging." Sarah frowned. In her 2 years of park attendance, she'd never heard the parent community describe anyone as challenging. Difficult children, yes, every parent had their moments. But the way David said it, the way Mrs. Henderson was pursing her lips, suggested something more significant. "What do you mean by challenging?" Sarah asked, though she was beginning to get an uncomfortable feeling about the direction this conversation was taking. Mrs. Henderson glanced around to make sure no children were within hearing distance. "The child has special needs. Significant ones, from what I understand. The Wilsons from Oak Street mentioned seeing them at the grocery store last week. They said the boy was disruptive." The word hung in the air like a judgment already passed. Sarah felt a knot forming in her stomach. She'd worked with special needs children during her college years, volunteering at a summer camp that specialized in inclusive activities. She knew how quickly misunderstanding could turn into exclusion, how fear could masquerade as protection. "Disruptive how?" she asked carefully. David shifted uncomfortably, adjusting Marcus on the swing. "Look, Sarah, we all want to be understanding. But we have to think about our own children too. This is supposed to be a safe space where kids can play freely. And it will continue to be," Sarah said, her voice carrying a firmness that surprised even her. "All children deserve safe spaces to play." Mrs. Henderson's expression tightened. "Of course they do. But there are facilities specifically designed for children with special needs. Wouldn't everyone be happier if they used those instead?" The conversation was interrupted by a squeal of delight from the swing set. Emma had successfully claimed one of the big swings and was pumping her legs with determined concentration, trying to swing as high as the older kids. The sight of her daughter's pure joy provided a stark contrast to the adult conversation brewing around the park benches. Other parents had begun to gravitate toward their discussion group. Linda Johnson approached with Sophia in tow, having clearly caught wind of the topic from the body language alone. Tom Mitchell, father of 7-year-old Jake, wandered over with his coffee still steaming in the crisp morning air. "Are we talking about the special needs situation?" Linda asked without preamble. "Because I have to say, I'm concerned about how this might affect the other children." "What kind of concerns?" Sarah asked, though she was beginning to feel like she was fighting a battle she hadn't signed up for. Tom cleared his throat. "Well, my Jake is very sensitive. If there's a child here who has outbursts or behavioral issues, it could be traumatic for him. And frankly, I don't think it's fair to put our children in that position." Sarah looked around at the group of parents, all of whom she'd considered friends just 15 minutes earlier. They were good people, she knew they were. They volunteered for school fundraisers, they helped each other with carpools, they remembered each other's children's birthdays. But in this moment, she was seeing something else, the way fear could narrow perspective, the way comfort could breed exclusion. "Has anyone actually met this family?" she asked. "Talked to them? Found out what their child's needs actually are?" The silence that followed was answer enough. They were making decisions about people they'd never met, children they'd never seen, based on second-hand information and assumptions. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of the park gate opening. Every head turned toward the entrance, and Sarah realized with a sinking heart that they were all expecting to see the family they'd been discussing. Instead, it was just the Kowalski family with their 2-year-old twins, but the moment had created an uncomfortable awareness of how quickly their little community could shift into an us versus them mentality as the morning progressed. The conversation continued in whispers and glances, creating an undercurrent of tension that seemed to infect the very air of their usually peaceful Saturday sanctuary. At exactly 10:15, the moment every parent had been unconsciously waiting for arrived. The park gate swung open with its familiar metallic creak, and a man in his early 30s stepped through, followed by a woman with kind eyes and tired shoulders. Between them walked a boy who immediately captured everyone's attention. Tommy was 8 years old, though his movements carried the unpredictable rhythm of someone navigating the world differently than others. He had Down syndrome, which was evident in his facial features, but what struck Sarah most was the pure excitement radiating from his small frame as he took in the playground before him. "Swings!" Tommy exclaimed, his voice carrying across the park with unbridled enthusiasm. "Daddy, swings!" His father, Michael, smiled and placed a gentle hand on his son's shoulder. "Yes, buddy, we can try the swings. But remember what we talked about, we wait our turn and we share with other kids." Tommy nodded vigorously, his entire body bouncing with anticipation. His mother, Jennifer, surveyed the park with the cautious eyes of someone who had learned to read environments quickly, assessing not just the physical safety of playground equipment but the emotional climate of the space they were entering. The change in the park's atmosphere was immediate and palpable. Conversations didn't stop, but they shifted, voices became quieter, more careful. Parents moved almost imperceptibly closer to their own children. It wasn't dramatic enough to be called obvious, but it was there, hanging in the air like humidity before a storm. Tommy, oblivious to the subtle social dynamics playing out around him, made a beeline for the swing set. Emma was still occupying one of the big swings, lost in her own world of aerial adventure. The other 3 swings stood empty, chains moving slightly in the morning breeze. "Can I swing, Daddy?" Tommy asked, his hands already reaching for the chains of the swing next to Emma. "Of course you can," Michael replied, but Sarah noticed how his eyes swept the area, taking inventory of the other parents and children nearby. It was the look of someone who had learned to be vigilant, not because his child was dangerous, but because the world could be dangerous to his child. Tommy climbed onto the swing with the determined concentration of a child who had practiced this movement many times. His motor skills were different, less fluid than typical 8-year-olds, but his determination was absolute. He gripped the chains tightly and began the familiar rhythm of pumping his legs. For the first few minutes, everything proceeded normally. Tommy swung with pure joy, occasionally calling out to his parents, "Look how high!" or "I'm flying." Emma, curious about her new swing neighbor, began to steal glances at him between her own aerial maneuvers. Then Tommy began to make sounds, happy sounds, vocal expressions of the sheer pleasure he was experiencing. They weren't words exactly, but rather a soundtrack of contentment that bubbled up from somewhere deep inside him. To Sarah, who understood that this was simply Tommy's way of expressing joy, the sounds were endearing. but she could see from the faces around her that others were interpreting them differently. Mrs. Henderson's expression had tightened into what Sarah recognized as her concerned citizen face. David Chun had stopped pushing Marcus and was now standing protectively close to the baby swings. Linda Johnson had actually moved Sophia away from the sandbox and was now stationed near the climbing frame, keeping a clear line of sight to the main swing set. The tipping point came when Tommy, in his excitement, began swinging slightly erratically. His rhythm was different, less predictable than the steady back-and-forth motion the other children maintained. At one point, his swing came close to Emma's, not dangerously close, but close enough that Emma had to time her own swinging to avoid a collision. "Mommy!" Emma called out, not in fear but in the matter-of-fact way children announce changes in their environment. "The boy is swinging funny." That single sentence seemed to catalyze the tension that had been building all morning. Mrs. Henderson stood up from her bench with the purposeful movement of someone who had reached a decision. David Chun positioned himself more prominently near the swing set. Tom Mitchell, who had been relatively quiet, began walking toward his son Jake with determined steps. "Excuse me," Mrs. Henderson called out, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had appointed herself spokesperson for the group. "Excuse me, sir." Michael looked up from where he had been watching Tommy with paternal pride. "Yes. I'm afraid your son is making the other children uncomfortable," Mrs. Henderson said, her tone attempting diplomacy but landing somewhere closer to accusation. "Perhaps there's a better area of the park where he could play?" The words hung in the air like a physical presence. Jennifer's face flushed red, not with embarrassment but with the anger of a mother who had heard variations of this conversation too many times. Tommy, still swinging, remained blissfully unaware of the adult drama unfolding around him. "Uncomfortable how?" Michael asked, his voice carefully controlled. "Well, he's making noises," Mrs. Henderson continued, emboldened by the nods of agreement from other parents. "And his swinging is unpredictable. What if he hits one of the other children?" David Chun stepped forward, adding his voice to the confrontation. "Look, we're not trying to be unreasonable here, but we have a responsibility to keep our children safe. Maybe there are other parks better suited to children with special needs." The phrase "children with special needs" was delivered with the kind of careful pronunciation people used when they wanted to sound politically correct while still maintaining distance. It was inclusion in theory but exclusion in practice. Tommy, finally sensing that something was wrong, slowed his swinging and looked around at the circle of adults that had formed. His joyful sounds quieted, replaced by a confusion that Sarah found heartbreaking. "Is everything okay, Daddy?" Tommy asked, his voice smaller now. Uncertain, Michael's jaw tightened, and Sarah could see him making the calculation that every parent of a special needs child had to make dozens of times a day: fight or flight, educate or retreat, stand ground or find peace. "Everything's fine, buddy," he said softly. "Keep swinging." But everything was not fine, and every adult in that park knew it. The circle of parents around the swing set had grown tighter, their collective energy shifting from cautious observation to active confrontation. Tommy continued swinging, but his movements had become more hesitant, his joyful sounds replaced by uncertain glances at the adults whose voices were growing louder and more insistent. "I think we're being very reasonable here," Tom Mitchell said, stepping forward with Jake trailing behind him. "We're just asking for consideration for all the children involved." Jennifer finally spoke, her voice trembling with barely contained emotion. "Consideration? You want us to leave because my son is happy? Because he's expressing joy in a way that makes you uncomfortable?" "It's not about comfort," Linda Johnson interjected, pulling Sophia closer to her side. "It's about safety. Your son's behavior is unpredictable, and frankly, our children shouldn't have to adapt to that." The word behavior hit like a slap. Sarah watched as Jennifer's face went through a series of emotions: hurt, anger, and finally, a steely determination that suggested this was far from the first time she'd had to defend her child's right to exist in public spaces. "His behavior," Jennifer repeated, her voice growing stronger. "You mean his happiness? His excitement about being able to swing like any other child?" Mrs. Henderson, apparently feeling that the situation needed her leadership, stepped closer to the family. "Look, Mrs. Harrison," Jennifer supplied, her chin lifting slightly. "Jennifer Harrison. And this is my husband Michael and our son Tommy." Mrs. Henderson continued with the patience of someone explaining something obvious to a child. I'm sure you understand that as parents, our first priority is our own children's well-being. Now, I'm not saying your son can't play, but perhaps there are more appropriate venues, more appropriate than a public park. Michael interrupted, his controlled demeanor beginning to crack. You're telling us that our son, who pays taxes through our family just like yours, doesn't have the right to use public facilities? The confrontation was drawing attention from across the park. Other families had stopped their activities to watch the drama unfolding by the swing set. Some parents were clearly uncomfortable with what they were witnessing, but no one was stepping forward to intervene. Tommy, sensing the rising tension, had stopped swinging entirely. He sat motionless on the swing, his hands gripping the chains tightly, his eyes moving from face to face as he tried to understand why all these adults were upset. "Daddy," he said quietly, "are we in trouble?" The question broke something in the atmosphere. For a moment, everyone fell silent, confronted with the reality of what they were doing, a group of adults making a child feel unwelcome for the crime of being different. But the moment of reflection was brief. David Chun, apparently feeling that someone needed to be the voice of reason, cleared his throat. "Look, no one's saying he's in trouble. We're just trying to find a solution that works for everyone. There are specialized programs, adaptive recreation centers. Wouldn't your son be happier with children who are more like him?" The suggestion hung in the air like poison. Sarah felt her hands clench into fists at her sides. The casual cruelty of it, the assumption that Tommy belonged somewhere else, anywhere else, as long as it wasn't here among normal children. Children who are more like him. Jennifer repeated, her voice dangerously quiet. "You mean children with Down syndrome? Because that's what you're really saying, isn't it? That my son doesn't belong here because he has a disability." "We didn't say that," Tom Mitchell protested, but his voice lacked conviction. "You didn't have to," Michael said, his own voice rising. "You've made it perfectly clear. My son laughs differently, moves differently, expresses joy differently, and that makes you uncomfortable. So your solution is to send him away." Emma, still on the swing next to Tommy, had been listening to the adult conversation with the intense focused children brought to situations they didn't quite understand but knew were important. Suddenly, she spoke up. "Tommy's not scary," she announced, her 6-year-old voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "He's just happy. Why are you being mean to him?" The question, delivered with the brutal honesty that only children possessed, seemed to hit the group of parents like a physical blow. Several of them shifted uncomfortably, suddenly unable to meet Emma's direct gaze. Sarah felt a surge of pride in her daughter, but also a crushing awareness of how quickly this situation was spiraling into something that would leave lasting scars on everyone involved, especially the children. "Emma's right," Sarah said, finally finding her voice. "Tommy isn't hurting anyone. He's just playing, just like every other child here." Mrs. Henderson turned on her with obvious irritation. "Sarah, I'm surprised at you. I thought you'd understand the concerns we're raising." "I understand fear," Sarah replied, her voice growing stronger. "I understand how easy it is to let discomfort turn into exclusion. But I don't understand how we can look at a happy child and decide he doesn't belong here." The confrontation might have continued indefinitely, might have escalated into something even uglier, but it was interrupted by an unexpected sound, Tommy laughing. Despite everything happening around him, despite the raised voices and obvious tension, Tommy had started swinging again. But this time, he was swinging in perfect synchronization with Emma, who had resumed her own swinging. The two children had found their own rhythm, their own solution to the adult's perceived problem. "Look, Daddy," Tommy called out, his voice bright with achievement. "Emma and I are swinging together. We're like a team." Emma giggled in response. "Yeah, we're the swing team." The sight of the two children playing together, finding joy in each other's company while the adults argued about whether they should be allowed to do so, created a moment of cognitive dissonance that no one could ignore. T was in that moment of uncomfortable awareness that Michael Harrison made a decision that would change everything. Michael Harrison looked around at the circle of parents, at their determined faces and self-righteous postures, at his son swinging happily beside Emma despite the hostility surrounding him. When he spoke, his voice was calm, measured, and carried the weight of absolute conviction. "You want to know why my son doesn't belong here," he said, his words cutting through the morning air with surgical precision. Let me tell you exactly why Tommy Harrison has no right to play in this park." The group fell silent, surprised by his seeming capitulation. Mrs. Henderson nodded approvingly, perhaps thinking she had finally gotten through to him. Michael continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "My son has no right to be here because he pays no taxes. He owns no property. He contributes nothing to this community." He paused, letting the words sink in before delivering the blow that would shatter everything they thought they knew. "Of course, neither do any of your children. But somehow, you've decided that only my son is unwelcome." The logic hit like a thunderbolt. Jennifer watched as the faces around her shifted from smugness to confusion to the dawning realization that they had been caught in their own contradictions. But Michael wasn't finished. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a business card, holding it up for everyone to see. "My name is Dr. Michael Harrison," he said, his voice carrying across the now silent park. "I'm the chief of pediatric surgery at Millfield General Hospital. The same hospital where half of your children were born. The same hospital where I've spent the last 12 years saving children's lives." The card trembled slightly in Mrs. Henderson's hands as she read it. Dr. Michael Harrison, MD, Chief of Pediatric Surgery. The title that commanded respect in every corner of their community. "6 months ago," Michael continued, his voice never wavering, "I operated on a 7-year-old boy who had been in a car accident. 13 hours of surgery to repair a lacerated liver and internal bleeding. I saved his life." He looked directly at Tom Mitchell. "That boy was your son, Jake." Tom's face went white. He looked down at Jake, who was staring up at him with wide, confused eyes, then back at Michael with growing horror. 3 years ago, Michael went on, I removed a brain tumor from a 4-year-old girl. The surgery was so delicate that other surgeons wouldn't attempt it. I did it because that little girl deserved a chance at a normal life." His gaze shifted to Linda Johnson. "That little girl was your daughter, Sophia." Linda's hands flew to her mouth, her eyes filling with tears as the realization hit her. "And last year," Michael said, his voice softening slightly, "I performed emergency surgery on twin boys who had been born with congenital heart defects. I spent 18 hours in that operating room, refusing to give up, because every child deserves to live." He looked at Mrs. Henderson. "Those boys were your grandsons, Marcus and Matthew." Mrs. Henderson's legs seemed to give out slightly, and she had to steady herself against the bench. The business card fell from her nerveless fingers. "So please," Michael continued, "tell me again why my son doesn't belong here. Tell me why the man who has dedicated his life to saving children, who has held your children's hearts in his hands, whose son's only crime is expressing joy differently than you're comfortable with, tell me why we don't deserve to be part of this community." The silence that followed was deafening. Parents who moments before had been united in their righteousness now stood scattered and ashamed, unable to meet each other's eyes, let alone Michael's steady gaze. Tommy, still swinging beside Emma, seemed to sense that something important had happened. "Daddy," he said, his voice cutting through the heavy silence, "did you tell them about how you fix kids?" "Yes, buddy," Michael replied, his voice gentle as he addressed his son. "I told them." Tommy beamed. "That's good. Maybe they won't be scared of me anymore." The innocence of his statement, the lack of any resentment or anger, seemed to break something in the assembled parents. Several of them were openly crying now, confronted with the pure heart of a child they had just tried to exclude. David Chun was the first to step forward. "Dr. Harrison," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, I don't know what to say." "You don't need to say anything to me," Michael replied. "But you might want to think about what you say to your children. About what you've taught them today, about how we treat people who are different." Emma, still swinging beside Tommy, piped up again. "Are you really a doctor who fixes kids?" "I am," Michael said, smiling at her. "That's so cool." Emma exclaimed. "Tommy, your daddy is like a superhero." Tommy's face lit up with pride. "Yeah. He saves kids. And he taught me how to be brave when I'm scared." The contrast was stark and devastating, the wisdom and kindness of the children versus the fear and prejudice of the adults. Every parent in that park was forced to confront the uncomfortable truth about what they had become. Mrs. Henderson slowly bent down to pick up the business card she had dropped. When she stood, her face was streaked with tears. "Dr. Harrison," she said, her voice shaking, You saved my grandson's lives. And I just tried to." She couldn't finish the sentence. "You tried to protect your grandchildren," Michael said quietly. "I understand that impulse. But sometimes, what we think is protection is really just fear. And fear makes us cruel to people who don't deserve it." As the weight of their actions settled over the group, something fundamental shifted in the atmosphere of Riverside Park. The morning that had started with exclusion and hostility was transforming into something else entirely, a moment of reckoning that would change not just how they saw Tommy Harrison, but how they saw themselves. And in the background, the sound of two children swinging together continued, a reminder that acceptance and friendship were possible when fear was set aside.